Thank you for joining Waterbreak. This episode is brought to you by Dusty Rose Tallow. To find out more about them, go to dustyrosetallow.com. Enjoy Waterbreak. Hey y'all, welcome to Waterbreak. It's good to be with you. I'm excited about the show coming up. We got an interview with Dr. John Leake, L-E-A-K-E, Dr. John Leake, on his book he co-authored with Dr. Peter McCullough on vaccines, mythology, ideology, and reality. But first, if you guys want to be in a conversation with us, make sure you email us at RenchMedia@gmail.com. Reach out to us, ask us questions. Every once in a while, we do a AMA.
Yep.
AMA. Ask me anything. Podcast, so you can reach out to us, email us questions too, and we'll definitely be getting to those questions sometime in the near future. I want to introduce to you our author, our guest today. John is a nonfiction author with a lifelong interest in medical history and forensic medicine. In 2021, he worked with Dr. Peter McCullough and was the primary author of their best-selling book, The Courage to Face COVID-19. Remember, that's 2021. Remember that time? He writes a daily investigative report for Focal Points. It's a Substack newsletter, and is secretary of the McCullough Foundation. It's always good to have someone from Texas on Waterbreak. John, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, John, after 5 years now, since 2020, why are you guys now writing a book on vaccines? I mean, shouldn't this have been written in, 1998 or, with Andrew or something along those lines?
Well, I mean, it's funny that you should say that. Dr. Wakefield, Andrew Wakefield, and we do have a chapter about his adventures. He wrote a seminal paper in The Lancet in 1998. We go into that. Our conclusion in our chapter on Dr. Wakefield is that he was completely right. Insofar as he made distinct claims, he said, and he cited very reliable witness testimony, we have grounds for concern that the MMR vaccine might be playing some causative role and the appearance of autism in some children. I just would like to say real quick for him, he didn't say we've determined there's a cause. He said we're concerned that that this may be playing a role. Mm-hmm. And so, I mention that because what happened to Dr. Wakefield, who was relentlessly smeared and stripped of his medical license and the whole bit, it's very characteristic of any medical professional who even questions. It's not coming out and making declarations. It's just, hey, I'm seeing some data. I'm talking to some patients that raise concerns to me. Just publishing that is enough to have you branded as a sort of heretic. So it was studying cases or vignettes like that of Dr. Andrew Wakefield in the wake of what we saw with the COVID-19 vaccine rollout in late 2020, 2021, that prompted me and my co-author, Peter McCullough, to start wondering about the entire vaccine enterprise. That's to say, not just the COVID-19 vaccine, which was this sort of new technological platform using messenger RNA genetic technology. We started with wondering about that, but then the further we got into our examination of that, the more we began to wonder about the entire vaccine enterprise going back 300 years. So we've been researching it for a few years, and now we've come out with our book.
So did Dr. Peter McCullough, did he kind of have a vaccine skepticism that kind of grew out of 2020? Did he not have that before then?
No, neither of us, and I should say I'm not a medical doctor. I do hold a master's degree in philosophy. My primary interest has been in true crime. I've written a few true crime books with a strong forensic scientific element in all of my books. But I have a lifelong interest in medical history. My grandfather was a Harvard-trained doctor and had a large library of medical history. So it's kind of an old hobby of mine. Dr. McCullough is a cardiologist and had never given a whole lot of thought to vaccines. He'd received
Yeah.
them all. His children, there are two of them, they'd received all of the vaccines on the childhood schedule. What really got us wondering about this was the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine. That was our kind of
Okay.
awakening, so to speak.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why, not just the vaccine, but really why 2020 in this conversation, this continuing conversation, even though it's 2025, is so important to kind of me and my wife, is because in 2020, um, we live in Moscow, Idaho, which is a blue dot in a red state, kind of thing. So Idaho is very red, but we're in a liberal town because of University of Idaho, because it's a college town. Well, our church got in a big fight. I guess a big fight, you can call it that. Our city council just tripped a switch when COVID started coming around, and they shut down downtown before there's one case of COVID in our town. So they declared a health emergency in March 2020 before there was even one no case of COVID. And so shut down my friend's restaurant and other friends' shops. And so we kind of got in this protesting war with our city council, telling them that they had signed this health emergency order where even if you were outside, you had to stand 6 feet apart or wear a mask, where you couldn't outside. And they had cops patrolling up and down downtown with clipboards and very Orwellian craziness. So the way my church would protest is we'd go sing hymns and psalms in downtown for 20 minutes, not stand 6 feet apart, not wear a mask, men, women, and children. And we did that every month as they kept renewing the health emergency order every month. And so after 6 months of protesting, they finally arrested. I ended up getting arrested as part of, it's men, women, and children out there singing. Well, I ended up getting arrested out of 200 people. Me and another couple got arrested. And, went to jail. President Trump retweeted my arrest. It went all over because we were exercising our First Amendment rights. We were exercising everything about the First Amendment right. We were worshiping, we were petitioning, we were gathering, we were assembling, everything. Well, they arrested me. And so I ended up getting arrested, and I ended up in this legal battle with my city. Thomas More Society backed me. And so anybody who kind of started fighting in 2020, I kind of tried to get to know or I got interested in, because there's multiple battles in 2020. Of course, the vaccine battle with Dr. Peter McCullough, and the supposed science driving the shutdown and driving the vaccines and stuff became an interesting topic to me. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientific expert. Not even close to even where you're at with your knowledge and your abilities. But I felt like I needed to know more about vaccines all of a sudden. I need to know about virology all of a sudden, a word I never even knew of probably before that. So 2020, I think, became a very kind of awakening ground for so many people, not just as it applies to the science of what we're going to talk about here, but also to the government, tyranny, the way of American life and so forth, that this topic is just really, I think, still a interest of mine in everything that's going on. What struck me is you guys started off the book with kind of going through the history of vaccines. And apparently, I mean, I didn't even know any of this. My history always, as an average American, I think most Americans' history starts in maybe around the 1860s, when the slaves were freed, and Lincoln and so forth. But apparently, there's vaccine history before the even 1850s.
Yes, I would say our story really begins in the year 1721. This was uh, we choose the year 1721 because that was the year in which a smallpox epidemic broke out in Boston, Massachusetts, which you will
America.
recall was a British colony at the time. And there was a procedure that I would say was a forerunner of vaccination. The name that was used by the medical establishment at that time was variolation, coming from the Latin word for smallpox, variola. And variolation involved taking pus from a smallpox pustule on a sick person, transferring it with a scalpel or a needle
Uh-huh.
to the arm, making a small incision on the arm of a healthy person, and rubbing some of this infectious material into the arm of the healthy person. None of the exact mechanism of any of this was understood at the time. The germ theory of medicine had not yet been developed. What's interesting is that at the time, medical people who were experimenting with this, they did refer to smallpox as a virus, but not in the modern 20th century scientific meaning of the word, which is a submicroscopic microorganism. The word virus in the early 18th century was used in the old Latin sense, which meant poison,
Mm-hmm.
something that causes you to feel sick, a poisonous, infectious material. But what
Okay.
exactly it was, nobody understood. So that is the beginning of this adventure, variolation. The results of variolation, all we have are observations at the time. In some people, it seemed to create a very mild illness, maybe localized blisters on the arm. And then the idea is if you survive the variolation procedure, you get a few blisters on your arm. The idea, the observation was once you have this illness once, you won't get it a second time. So the
Uh-huh.
idea with variolation is a little bit of inoculation with this poison would prevent you from suffering severe illness should you ever be exposed to smallpox in its full form. So the the observations were very mixed. Some people died of variolation. The famous Puritan minister
Cotton
who
Mather. Cotton Mather.
well, no, not Cotton Mather. He was actually the Puritan minister that advocated the procedure. Um,
Yeah.
Edward, oh God, no, Jonathan Edwards
Yes.
was
Right.
a bit later in the 18th century. He was variolated and died of it.
Huh.
Interestingly enough, two of the children of King George III and his wife Charlotta received the variolation and both contracted florid smallpox and died of it.
Mm-hmm.
So other people perceived that, well, maybe it did render some protection. But I think the takeaway of the adventure with variolation was those who seemed to receive some protection from it, a lot of this was a kind of religious perception that I've been protected, it worked. I
Hmm.
didn't then subsequently get smallpox. And Cotton Mather, who was a very famous Puritan minister in Boston in
Yep.
1721, he declared variolation a gift from God. And
Yeah.
it's a very interesting, moment in this history because we have Cotton Mather, who was an undoubtedly brilliant man, declaring it a gift from God, and we see this same religiosity about vaccines all the way up into 2021 with the COVID-19 vaccine. If you look at the cover of the book, it depicts a 20 euro silver coin issued by the Vatican. And if
Yeah.
you have a copy of the book, I gave away all
Yeah.
my copies at a luncheon today. That 20 euro silver coin issued by the Vatican is a commemoration of the COVID-19 vaccine, and
Wow.
it depicts a boy preparing to receive the vaccine. That's
Amazing.
what's described in the catalog. And if you look at that statement in Italian, a boy prepares to receive the vaccine, it's the exact same grammar as a boy prepares to receive the Holy Eucharist. So the vaccine is
Wow.
conferring protection that is akin to divine protection. And
Yeah.
I think this religious archetype is something that you see throughout the entire vaccine history for 300 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Question kind of following that. It was really interesting to read the history starting so many hundred years ago. And you guys did a great job. You went into quite a bit of detail, I think, and you kind of walked us through history and also focused on different well-known outbreaks, the influenza, the smallpox, polio, all the things that people think of when they think of, oh, well, this is why you get vaccinated, or this is what vaccination has done for us as a civilization over time. If you could just like take a few minutes, because you've done so much research, could you sum up your takeaways having actually deep dived the history? Because throughout it, you guys brought up a lot of good points, like maybe sometimes the benefits of actual sanitation are actually being given
Fixing
or
things.
commuted
Yeah.
to a vaccination coming out at a certain time, uh, among other things. So what are your major takeaways having done all the research over the last 300 years of vaccination?
Well, we think that some vaccines um, have have conferred protection to some people who receive them some of the time, but we examine this on a case by case basis. And the final analysis, what you see is that mankind's love affair with vaccines is you get into the 18th and you get into the 19th century and then the early 20th. What we see happening at the same time is this early developmental stage of vaccines, particularly in the latter part of the 19th century. At the same time that vaccines are being developed, the Western world, the great cities of England and continental Europe and the United States, they're at the
Right.
same time experiencing tremendous strides in the elevation of living standards. So enormous strides in the production of food, the distribution of food. You have the steam engine coming on, canals, food transport, the
Sewer
development.
systems.
Right.
Well, I'm starting with nutrition, which is, believe it or not, the most important. Believe it or not, in our era of calorie abundance, where the big struggle is to try and slim down. If we go back to the 19th and even the early 20th century, all the way up into the Great Depression, the problem was the opposite. People were oftentimes hungry. They didn't get enough nourishment. Not only were they undernourished, they were malnourished, meaning they didn't get enough essential nutrients, vitamins, and so forth. It's oftentimes surprising to people to hear, we think of scurvy, of vitamin C deficiency, or rickets, vitamin D deficiency. We think of these as extreme deficiencies that you would only have on board, a ship in the middle of the Pacific, something like this. But in fact, there were scurvy cases of scurvy and rickets even in England, on the mainland,
Yeah.
as late as the end of the 19th century. So, with people becoming better and better nourished, their bodies, their immune systems became more robust, particularly in these early childhood years,
Yeah.
at fending off or decreasing the severity of infectious disease. So nutrition is enormous. It's probably the biggest.
Mhm.
The other one is sanitation. I think a lot of
Yeah.
Americans would be shocked by the utter squalor of American and European cities, really
Yeah.
all the way up until the 1930s.
Yeah.
A
Right.
lot of people are sort of astonished to hear that London, the greatest city on earth in the 19th century, did not complete its sewer to channel the city's effluent away from the city until 1885.
Yeah.
Construction
Wow.
began in the 1850s. But in other words, you had raw sewage in the Thames. You had raw sewage coming up into the groundwater, into the well water of the city.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
just none of the public sanitation, food hygiene, proper handling of milk and food and storage and refrigeration and on and on and on. Just over 100 years ago, these technologies were not widespread. So people were poor, they were undernourished, they lived in squalor, they drank sewage water quite literally, until the advent of natural gas and even gas derived from coal. The primary
Mhm.
energy was coal. So, there's descriptions of London fog, which is actually just
Hmm.
coal smoke.
Huh?
You had an enormous prevalence of severe bronchitis already going from poor air quality, and then you get some kind of pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia cooking on top of severe bronchitis. People didn't have a chance. So
Right.
what you see. Oh, and then the last thing I'll throw in that's worth considering: the urban poor had dreadful housing. They lived in
Mm.
tenement buildings. They were not properly heated in the winter. People would be literally shivering in their little tenement buildings, small children, huddled close under one blanket. With the advent of proper heating and sanitation and housing, I mean, all of these things that we just completely take for granted now. I mean, it was a totally different picture just over 100 years ago. So, with these enormous advances in standards of living across the board, you can
Yeah.
see from looking at US vital statistics, the mortality rates from all of these diseases have already plummeted by over 90% before the modern vaccine schedule is introduced in
Right.
1948.
Right.
Right.
The
So
vaccine
usually,
now, I'm sorry to interject, but in the final
please.
analysis at the end of the 20th century, if you read a college medical school textbook, what gets the credit? Is it
Right.
nutrition? Is it sanitation? Is it housing, hygiene, transport of food, pasteurization of milk? No, it's vaccines. We're always told that it's
Yeah.
vaccines that cause
Right.
dramatic reduction of infectious disease mortality.
Yeah. Well, and you also mentioned, at least when you were talking about influenza, which is a huge one, that at least if I understood you guys right, that so much of the death, so called death from influenza outbreak, was actually due to secondary bacterial infection, like bacterial pneumonia, where that was a huge issue before we discovered penicillin. Is that correct?
That is correct. So I would say that the kind of Super Bowl of what we now call biodefense. I mean, where the whole industry, and it's a vast one, of pandemic preparation, that whole concept, that whole idea began with the great Spanish influenza of 1918. So you'll
Right.
recall that was the last year of the First World War. You had millions of men herded into military training camps, onto trains and ships, and then finally, last stop into these trenches in Europe.
Mm.
And it
Yeah.
was within the context of this military activity, millions of men from all over being herded into these same tight spaces, that you get the emergence of this virulent influenza of 1918. And yes, even at the time, there were autopsies performed, and what the army pathologists discovered is these young fellows are dying of of florid, an extremely aggressive staphylococcal infection of the lungs.
Okay.
So it's very likely that if we had another flu that came along of the same virulence of the 1918 influenza, in the developed world, mortality would be severely are strongly diminished by simply the administration of antibiotics, which they did not
Right.
have in 1918. Never mind better nutrition, better hygiene, a better medical care across the board,
Right.
more hygienic military facilities. But yes, I think we talk about yet another massive advance in the standard of living, was the development, widespread use of penicillin. That was in 1945. And then you had erythromycin, which was developed in 1952.
Right.
And these are extremely valuable drugs for controlling some of these respiratory viral illnesses, well, and which have the secondary bacterial effect.
Right.
So one of the areas where I get in debates on this issue when we're talking about vaccines is usually a lot of people will point back to polio.
Yes.
Oh, look at polio. Oh, look at the polio
Right.
vax. Look at how much problems it solved. Maybe kind of just walk us through that as a specific example, and then I want to get to kind of our modern context.
Yeah, so polio is a very, very interesting case, and in many ways, I would like to kind of single that out as you asked for special attention and consideration. So, the first thing to understand is that polio is what we call an endemic disease, meaning it's always present. It apparently always has been present universally. There is evidence that polio goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. And that there's evidence that polio was also prevalent even among the Indians of Mesoamerica. So endemic meaning it's always there. Now, the perception, the thought is that if a child is exposed to polio, and the thought is that all children, virtually without exception, all over the world, were always exposed to polio in their early infancy, roughly between 6 months and 5 years.
Okay.
If a child who's otherwise healthy is exposed to the polio virus in early infancy, it's an extremely mild disease. It's confined to the throat and the digestive tract. It's excreted through feces, and all children were exposed to it. It was in this early stage of life. It's a mild disease. They then developed immunity to it, and it was not a problem as they got later in life. Okay, so the second observation about polio is there's absolutely no records in medical literature of there being anything like a polio outbreak. That is, a cluster of cases of severe polio, what we call paralytic polio. Some lameness, and it could be severe lameness or it could be mild and transitory lameness, often of the legs. There was no descriptions of epidemic outbreaks of polio until the end of the 19th century. Then it only really becomes something that's regularly observed after the 1920s. And then you start seeing these yearly summer epidemics that are observed and that are recorded, really starting in the 40s. So the question is, what is going on? And I linger on this. You'll pardon me for being slightly technical. The thought is this. These cases of severe polio that were often observed during the summer months, the observation was it's often the children of the affluent who are developing these cases of paralytic polio. And I should say they're very rare. I mean, the worst summer on record was 52. And in that summer, there were about 22,000 cases out of a nation of 160 million people of some degree of paralytic polio. Okay, so 22,000 cases. A lot of those cases resolved without lifelong paralysis. Okay, so in that year 52, there are 10 times more people, including children, who were killed in accidents. But what happened in the year 1952? It's the first moment in American history where we truly have a unified mass media. Everybody had a radio. There's high rates of literacy with the newspapers. About 30% of the nation had a television. Okay.
Yeah.
So what seems to be happening with polio is, if you'll linger on the observation, is that it's oftentimes the children of the affluent. The thought is this. Because of improvements and water sanitation, children of the affluent might make it all the way through this early period in which polio is a mild disease and only be exposed to it after the age of 5, say 5, 6, 7, 8, when it's a severe disease. And it was
Mm.
oftentimes during the summer months. So, what was probably happening is you had kids who were not exposed to polio in their infancy when it's a mild disease. They then go to the beach in the summertime or to the lake. They get a big dose of raw sewage, and they have this exposure later in life when it's a more severe disease. I think that's very important to understand. So, in terms of what do we make of polio, there's a few things that I think we should make of it. First of all, the risk of paralytic polio is vastly overblown. It's the first public health scare in the mass media age. Okay,
Okay.
there was such relentless messaging about polio in the early 50s that they did surveys of American people, some of whom said they're more afraid of polio than atomic war with the Russians. So
Okay.
it's an example of the mind being so relentlessly focused on one perceived and partially real threat to health that people
Yeah.
completely lose all perspective on it. The second
Wow.
thing, the second thing is we still must remember, even with polio, that for the vast majority of children who are exposed to it, well over 99%, it's still a very mild illness. In 75% of children, they don't even know they have it.
Right.
So the other thing about polio is we think that the modern, more contemporary iterations of the polio vaccine are safe, but stop to consider, and this is oftentimes forgotten in the literature, the initial rollout of the polio vaccine had one of the greatest safety disasters in all of vaccine history, namely the
Right.
Cutter incident, in
Right.
which thousands of children were directly injected with live polio virus because the Cutter labs in California, the inactivation procedure was not done properly. The
Mm.
other thing, following the initial Cutter incident with the inactivated polio vaccine, we had these incidents with the not the Salk vaccine, but the Sabin vaccine, in which you would have after it's a live attenuated virus in the Sabin vaccine. After passing through the gut, it could reverse its attenuation and become quite virulent. So you actually
Yeah.
had kids that got polio from being exposed to water contaminated with the vaccine. So why am I going into all of these technical details? Our big takeaway from the polio vaccine is there were these big safety problems, and there are a few other ones as well, but I won't bore
Yeah.
you with details. What we learned from the rollout of the polio vaccine is that when you're rushing a new vaccine, you can have these safety disasters. That's the
Right.
lesson that should have been learned for the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine in early 2019. But that
Right.
lesson from the polio vaccine was flouted, it was completely
Right.
disregarded.
That's
Okay.
correct. Was it rushed just like the COVID
Yeah.
vaccine?
That's what I was thinking.
Uh,
Exactly.
rollout was so rushed. They skipped so many steps. Did that happen back in the day with polio?
Well, there were a lot of virologists, in the day, including John Enders, who was first able to culture poliovirus in human tissue, who believed that and who stated he thought that the Jonas Salk inactivated vaccine held promise, but Enders himself said, "I think this is dangerous. I think that the probability of a safety incident is too high." So there was even criticism at the time, but yes,
Yeah.
it was rushed out. Yes.
Ugh, man, we do not learn from
So
our own history
no,
very
and
well,
then
do we?
you had the swine flu problem in the 70s.
Right. That didn't go well.
And that didn't go well.
No.
And then you start having the vaccine schedule start to roll out, 80s and 90s, where and then you start having this real. I mean, I think that's where people stopped being really suspicious in a way they should be about government mandates and government, suggestions, to lightly put it, on vaccines. I remember, the one reason why I was skeptical about the COVID vaccine is just probably more from my mom. My mom grew up a hippie, and hippies didn't do any of that stuff, and so I had this kind of, I don't know, hippie-ish instinct already in me when the COVID vaccine started coming out. I was like, I'm not going to take that. I mean, me and my wife, when we had our babies in the hospital, we wouldn't let them jab our kids right when they were born. That was just instinctually to me crazy.
Yeah.
And again, you always have to say this because of the propaganda that's out there. You always have to say, I'm not against vaccines per se, and I'm not per se, although I'm way more skeptical than I ever have been. But I wasn't going to jab my kids when they were born. I don't think that's just how God created them, how God created the process.
Not only that, but I mean, this is a very important thing, and we talk about it in the book, is that if you believe in vaccines, let's just start with the proposition that somebody believes in vaccines. So sufficiently so that the mother has herself received the vaccines in the schedule. She will, through her placenta and through her breast milk, she will provide protection to all of these infectious, provided her immunization has really worked. She will provide protection to the infant for the first 6 years of life. So there's really no reason for an infant fresh out of the mama's womb to receive a bunch of vaccines. I mean, we can just take that off the table. There's a lot of things that we realize as we walk through this on a case by case basis, that vaccines have become a kind of article of religious faith without any distinctions, any fine points, without looking at these things on a case by case basis. It's just all of these vaccines are good. Everybody, one size fits all children should receive all of them at the exact same time.
Right.
And after
Right.
after the vaccine manufacturers received liability protection in
Yep.
1986,
Yep.
suddenly the vaccine schedule proliferates from really a handful of
It
shots
grows.
to now something like 72 shots between infancy and 18. And so the thing that we're really concerned about, I should say that some of this would be something of an academic debate, and we could kind of argue about which vaccines the parents should consider and which ones really are non-essential. Were it not for the fact that vaccines are mandatory for children to attend public school. So it's not like a lot of products where you sort of weigh the benefits and risk
Yep.
and say, something, maybe this isn't for me. It's you have to get them in order to attend school.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
The second thing is, unlike every other product that has widespread consumption in the United States, vaccines have liability protection. So if a child is injured or killed, the parents can't go to the product manufacturer and file a civil complaint for damages. You
Right.
just can't.
Right.
We're protected by the 1986 Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. Now, you can go to this compensation fund that's been set up by the act, and you could say, "Hey, gee whiz, can you spare a few bucks for some bereaved parents?" But that is an extremely difficult, long process. It's in which the so-called vaccine court is doing everything it can to find that there is no causal link. So most of the
Right.
complaints that are made to the vaccine court are rejected out of hand. So, you say the kids have to get it. The vaccine manufacturers have liability protection, and we are observing this stunning spike in autism prevalence that on a timeline plots, lockstep with the proliferation of vaccines on the schedule.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you really see this kind of parabolic, launching of the autism epidemic right after 1986. So,
Yep.
this raises profound questions, and our conclusion is all of this needs to be carefully reevaluated. The
Yeah.
entire enterprise, we
Yeah.
need to go case by case. The other thing to consider is that a lot of vaccines on the schedule are now very old technologies. And interestingly enough, there was a case called Bruisewitz versus Wyeth, a Supreme Court case in 2010 that tested the constitutionality of the 1986 Vaccine Injury Act, granting liability protection. The court ruled in favor of Wyeth, which was the vaccine manufacturer. But there was a dissenting justice, namely Justice Sotomayor. Interestingly, she's sort of considered the quintessential liberal justice. But in this case, she took the dissenting view, and she wrote in her dissenting opinion, every other product, its safety and its optimization is largely incentivized by legal liability. It's when someone can go to a court in a state and say, look, the product injured me or my children. That incentivizes the manufacturer to look at the product and to see if there's any way it can be made more effective, more safe, whatever. But only with vaccines do we have this situation where a lot of these technologies are old, they haven't been optimized, and there's no incentive to do so.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
Justice Sotomayor had a good point, and the liability protection really needs to be carefully reconsidered.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I just can't believe that they have liability protection. Was it Reagan who did that?
it was in Reagan's administration.
Which is
Yeah.
just crazy to
Yeah.
me. It just looks so bad, and
Yeah.
it is such a perverse incentive.
Yeah.
Is anyone talking about, can you just repeal something like that? Is there conversation at least? Because it sounds crazy to me.
So HHS Secretary Robert Kennedy has been talking about this for a long time.
Yeah.
And, he's pointed out that, it's kind of a paradox because the vaccine manufacturer said, vaccines are totally safe. Parents don't need to worry about them. But then in the next breath, they went before Congress and they said, look, they're safe. They're just not safe for everybody. I mean, it's kind of like George Orwell's, 1984. What is the formulation? All men are born equal. Some are just born more equal than others.
Right.
So vaccines are safe. They're just not safe for everybody. So what the vaccines manufacturers argued was, in a relatively small percentage of cases, some children are going to be injured and or die.
Yeah.
However, the government needs to view vaccines as something like a strategic public health asset, something akin to a sort of military biodefense asset.
Mhm.
So just as in war, some young soldiers must die in order to defend the homeland.
Yeah.
It's just the nature of the beast that in order to protect for the greater good of the population, some children are going to be injured and killed. And we vaccine manufacturers can't afford to manufacture these vaccines if we're going to be subjected to legal liability, to lawsuits that could be financially injurious to our concerns. So
Right.
that was the logic that was presented. Now, I suppose, you might say, all right, fellas, well, we'll give you a pass for now, but y'all are really going to have to, keep working on these things. Instead, what we've seen is the vaccine manufacturers said, well, thanks for the liability protection. And by the way, we have a whole bunch more vaccines that we'd also
Right.
like to add to the schedule. And needless to say, they too will have liability protection.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
So John, do you have time for one more question? I know we're pushing your
Yeah,
limits
we
here.
are.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I want to end last question here, just to try to kind of be fair to this conversation. I believe that God gave, medicine. I believe that I'm not scared of taking risks and stuff. I'm not, we live in a fallen world, which means people are, disease is inevitable in our fallen world. So, and I don't mind medical ways of fighting it. Now, which means I believe that I'm sure now I'm more skeptical than I ever have been in the whole vaccine world and the whole vaccine science and propaganda that's been pushed on us. But at the same time, give me like a good argument for kind of the positive nature of vaccines and where we've seen great success and how to think about them in a balanced way.
Well, I would say with measles, mumps, rubella, um, pertussis, I would say that what vaccines have done is they've dramatically reduced the case count. Okay, when I say case count, what I mean by that is just kids who get the illness. Okay,
Yeah.
so for example, the measles vaccine, there can be no doubt that after the measles vaccine was rolled out in 1963, kids stopped getting measles. I didn't get
Uh-huh.
measles. I got the measles vaccine, but I didn't get measles. Pretty much anyone born before 1963, they all got measles.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So
Right.
that's great. I didn't have to stay at home and suffer through a week of measles. I did have to suffer through a week of chicken pox.
Oh yeah. So die.
So, so what I can say is that's the benefit, and then in very very rare cases, there are extreme complications that may arise from measles. Let's take measles just as our example. Okay, but nevertheless, if you look at the whole decade prior to the rollout of the measles vaccine in 63, so 52 to 62. During that decade, all American children got measles, all of them. And you're talking
Yeah.
about a population in those years of millions and millions of children would get measles every year. Okay?
Right.
See if you can guess during that decade the average number of measles deaths, total number in the whole country during this decade from 42 to 52, 52 to 62.
I think your book said something like 22,000.
No, about 400 per year.
I
So
read a
close.
different quote then. I was so
Wow.
close,
So,
and I quoted your book.
but yeah, that was really bad. But so really
Uh,
low. And this was
400.
pre measles vaccine.
But just hang on. So about 400 fatalities. Okay, now if you were to go and you were to look at all 400 of those, it's almost a matter of certainty that most of those children had comorbidities. They had
Yeah.
congenital illnesses. They had
Yeah.
other congenital illnesses of the lungs. The other thing, most children who die of measles, they die of a secondary bacterial pneumonia,
Mhm.
Yeah.
and that's treatable with some. So the benefit is most children are spared of ever getting measles, of ever having to stay home to get the measles rash. That's great. But if we're living in an era in which the measles vaccine is one of many that are administered to children and all at the same time, and we now live in a situation where there are about 250,000 children in this country who have profound autism. That
Yeah.
means profound autism, totally disabled,
Yeah.
nonverbal, require round the clock care for the rest of their lives. What you need to do then is The suspicion is that the hypervaccination schedule, which includes the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, that could be a contributing causal factor in this terrifying increase of autism prevalence, including profound autism. So
Yeah.
you need to do a risk benefit analysis on this. If the MMR, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine is contributing to this, and there's good grounds for suspecting it is, that needs
Yeah.
to be investigated.
Yeah. Yeah, very much.
100%.
Very much. Hey, John, thank you for giving your time to Waterbreak. Really appreciate it. Y'all need to pick up the book, Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality. You
It's
can
a
pick it
very
up.
interesting
Where do you
read.
prefer people to pick it up? Where's your ideal place?
Amazon, the bookstores are still a little queasy about stocking any book that's skeptical of. And I want to say right here, it's a good thing to end on. The book is not anti-vax.
That's right.
We examine the pros and cons of all vaccines. We give them all a fair shake. We're not against the concept altogether. We just think that it needs to be carefully evaluated. Amazon has been good enough to sell the book. You can find it on Amazon. It'll be on your doorstep a day later.
Okay.
Awesome.
Everyone, thank you for joining Waterbreak. Email us, RenchMedia@gmail.com. Until next week,